All right, well, we will get to start talking, because I don't want to lose a moment here with Nicholas and Sheryl. They probably don't need an introduction, but I will do a plug for the books, which are bestsellers. I don't really need the plug, those being Half the Sky and A Path Appears. A Path Appears, the most recent one, released in, was it 2 years ago? 3?
Yeah.
3 now.
3 now, okay,
yeah.
14, okay. So, A Path Appears, the New York Times described it as the book that was both upsetting and uplifting. Why do they describe it that way?
You know, there are many, truths that underbellies of the U.S. that we talk about, and also the rest of the world. And we do tell stories that are very gripping, but we also tell very uplifting stories. So, for instance, we talk about Shauna, who is blonde hair, blue eyes, born in Tennessee with heroin in her system. And she was initiated into prostitution at the age of 9 by her mother. So that's a really gripping story we talk about. But then we also talk about someone named Ollie Neal, who is an incredible man living in the 1950s in Arkansas. And he's a troublemaker. He's a boy in high school. He's a real troublemaker. The entire school was full of kids like him, but he was especially obnoxious to the teachers, especially a librarian named Mrs. Grady. And he was cutting school. He's cutting classes, English classes, as he was, wont to do. And he was wandering through the library. And he basically was looking through some of the books, not that he ever reads books, but he happened to see a picture of a woman, a beautiful woman, clad very scantily, and he thought, this looks very interesting, and he thought he would, take out the book. But then he thought, I'm a cool, tough kid. I don't read books. So he looked around, he took the book, and he put it under his jacket, and he stole the book. Well, then he read it at home, and he was amazed by this book. And he thought, wow, I didn't know that books could be so interesting. He went back to the library, put it back in, and he saw another book by the same author, Frank Yerby. And he thought, oh, I didn't see this before. And he took that one, too, walked out, and he read it. And pretty soon, he thought, reading isn't so bad. He did this 2 more times, and he became a reader. He actually started doing his homework. He went to classes. He actually excelled at school. He graduated from high school, which was very rare. He was a black American at the time, very rare for a kid his age in that period of time, in that location, in Arkansas. He went to college, which was even more rare, and then he went to law school. He became, one of the first black lawyers to work in the Attorney General's office in Arkansas, and then he became a judge, Judge Ollie Neal, which was really remarkable for someone with his background. And so over the years, he would go back to this reunion from the high school. He was the most, prominent person from the high school, and he would run into Mrs. Grady. And so one time, he actually was telling Mrs. Grady, thank you, you just don't know how important your little library has been in my life. It really turned me around. And she goes, thank you very much. And he says, but I have a confession. I stole some of your books. And Mrs. Grady turned to him and said, you know something, Ollie? I have a confession, too. I saw you steal those books. What had happened was she was watching as Ollie was about to steal the book, and she was furious. She thought, he can check it out for free, and yet he has to steal the book. And she was about to confront him when she had a flash of insight, of empathy, and she realized that here is a boy, a tough kid, who just couldn't bear being seen checking out a book. So she let him steal it. And then in the off chance that he might like this book by Frank Yerby, she drove 50 miles to Tennessee to look for a bookstore that had other books by Frank Yerby on her own dime.
Wow.
She went to like 3 bookstores, and maybe in the 3rd or the 4th bookstore, she finally found a used book by Frank Yerby. She bought it with her own dime, then she drove back on her own dime, and she put that book on the shelf where the first one was. And when she saw Ollie steal that second book, she was thrilled. This woman, and it's just, it's just so heartwarming. Mrs. Grady was also African American. She could have been bitter for all her life because she had no advantages. She had every reason to be bitter. And yet, this big-hearted woman opened up and did the best for someone like Ollie, who was obnoxious to her, who was a troublemaker. And she reached out, she helped kids like Ollie and others. So that's a really uplifting story. It really, inspires, can inspire all of us, really.
And what that does is it backs up what your research says, which is that kindness is inherent to all of us. Feeling good comes as a result of that. So my question is, why does it seem that that has been lost in so many facets of society today? Subsets, perhaps, but...
So there's pretty good evidence that we are hardwired to feel compassion for somebody in front of us. And that seems to have been developed because it protected your genes, and it helped transmit them to the next generation. And so even with very young kids, they want to comfort an adult who seems to be hurt, and they will even give a teddy bear to that adult who pretends to be hurt in experiments. But while it was genetically advantageous to have this empathy for somebody right next to you, right now, typically needs are not somebody right next to you. They're somebody who is across town or somebody who is across the world. And we also are hardwired to divide between in-groups and out-groups. And we make these instantaneous judgments, and often race, for example, becomes a proxy for that, or various other things. And so those tend to impede precisely that empathy that would, so we live in an age when we become aware of needs halfway around the world, but we do not have empathy for those needs.
So is that the one way the internet may have not connected us to back up the statistic, or rather explain it? When you say, look, the most affluent 20% of the population donates in proportion less than the share of those in the lowest 20% of the population in terms of giving to charity. Is it because we don't see it necessarily, or the efficacies, or how that will be used? Or?
There's essentially an empathy gap, and that's reflective of it, that the wealthiest 20% give only about half as much as a percentage of incomes as the bottom 20%. And it seems to be because if you are affluent in America, you're not intrinsically less empathetic or less good than anybody else, but you tend to be insulated from need. You live in a nice neighborhood, your colleagues, your friends tend to be better off, and so need is something that you're intellectually aware of, but not something that you encounter every day. In contrast, if you were poor in America, then every day you encounter somebody needier than yourself, and confronted by that, you respond, even though you get no tax benefit because you're not itemizing your deductions. And, I also think that there is a real failure in the humanitarian community, if you will, in that we do know how to bridge this empathy gap. And it's essentially two central lessons. One, that the way to build that initially is about putting an individual face on it, making this about one person, creating an emotional connection, not a statistical one, not a rational one. And the other thing is that it can't be endlessly depressing. There has to be some sense of uplift, of possibility that one can make a difference. And yet, if you look at news coverage of humanitarian crises, if you look at what aid groups are doing, then it's all about, 20 million people in 4 countries are facing starvation.
And you become anesthetized to it. It's too massive.
That's right.
It's another number, another figure.
That's right. And we are willing, and indeed, hardwired to be willing to help, one particular individual out there if we think it's going to make a difference. But these appeals for 20 million people are almost guaranteed to make us numb and turn the page and try to help some puppy that is stuck in a hole somewhere.
Well, they've done some really interesting research that shows that when you show a photo of a girl who's starving from Africa, people will donate, right? But then as soon as you add another person, maybe her brother in the photo, donations drop by half.
Really?
Because people think, they look at this, I can make much more of a difference by helping this one girl, but Now it has to be split in two. I can't make that much of a difference. That's sort of the logic that goes behind it, but it is true that that's what happens when people see a photo of more people.
So how do you rise above that? How do we say, as you guys will purport that in the book and in your research and discussions, you say, look, the individual can make a huge difference, but not everybody here has the platform of Nick and Sheryl or Norman and Ava, where you really can reach the masses. How do you convince people that, yeah, one person can make a huge difference? Does it have to be the place where you're looking to make the difference? Does it have to be your neighborhood, localized? Is that how you do it?
You know, I'd say there are two lessons. I mean, one lesson to me, and I must say it's been amplified since the Trump administration took office, is that advocacy is just incredibly important. You know, why was the ACA not repealed? It's because people showered their congressional offices with phone calls, and that really made a difference. Planned Parenthood is on the chopping block. It provided 270,000 cervical cancer screenings last year. And what is going to determine whether it continues to get funding is whether people call their congressional office. So I think advocacy is incredibly important. I mean, we have 3 kids, and we've tried to experiment at the private level in trying to engineer our kids to be more empathetic and compassionate. And of course, we learned very quickly that telling kids to be empathetic, no, that does not work. And so we've tried in our household to tie in, various gifts and holidays with an element of giving. And I knew we were getting somewhere when a few years ago I got the best Father's Day present ever. And with Father's Day coming up, I recommend this. There's my gift was a giant Gambian pouched rat, which is 3 feet long, nose to tail. They're the macho rats around, but what distinguishes them is they have very poor eyesight and excellent sense of smell. And so an aid group called a Popo has trained them to detect landmines and to diagnose tuberculosis, which is basically done by smell. And so my kids got me, I didn't take physical possession of my rat. Sheryl might not have been thrilled by that, but it was trained in my name. And so I went out to Angola to see my rat, to check out how my rat was doing. And a human deminer can typically mine about 15 square meters in a day. Very painstaking process. My rat, just so you know, my rat can demine 225 square meters in a day, and my rat works for bananas. And so, there are, and look, at the end of the day, I think our efforts to help other people, frankly, have a somewhat mixed record of success. But they do have this real record of helping ourselves. And I do think that these efforts to try to bring the kids involved, it has been to some degree helpful as a family, and try to inculcate some of these values in the kids.
I mean, we also know that, look, with the election, we can see that people do make a difference, even when you think that it comes down to the last, 1,000 votes or, several hundred votes.
Look at January 21st.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah.
I mean, it really does, you can make a difference. Right now, I mean, the Congress people, they're tabulating phone calls, so send those phone calls in if there's an issue that you care about. And I think that what we're seeing now is just a greater involvement in civil society, and that's really important, because most people think, oh, whatever I do is a drop in the bucket. But we are all drops in the bucket, and that's how buckets get filled, is with all of us. I mean, you can also buy your values. You can buy your values. Basically, look at the companies that or the products that you buy. What is the carbon footprint, if the environment is what you care about? What is what is the supply chain of the product that you buy? I mean, even Apple now is much more concerned about the supply chain. There's someone there who's inspecting the carbon footprint of their supply chain, and other people inspecting whether or not there's sweatshop labor being used. Not that that's an issue in itself, because we take a different view on that. But I think that you now have enough knowledge about certain companies who realize that consumers care, so you can buy your values. The other thing is, if you're also looking at companies who are doing better on ESG, so that's like, environment, social component, and also governance. whether you're investing in stocks or whether you're, buying their products or services. You can look at what these companies are doing. And now companies are, funds are coming up with ESG screened funds or screening out tobacco, alcohol, guns. Endowments now are beginning to do this. They're actually, saying, well, let's not, and it was, pretty chilling when it turned out that the endowment for the school at Sandy Hook, they had invested in one of, the gun company that was, made the guns that was used to kill a lot of those students. So there's also a real reason to do this, because in the long term, companies that actually, make the right decisions, whether it's sustainable decisions because of the environment, or whether it's because of the gender issues, hiring more women, or whether it's, not, being socially oppressive, it comes back to them to root. I mean, look at what happened with Fox. I mean, you could argue, well, okay, the sexual harassment that was seemingly pervasive by a few individuals at Fox, well, they only got rid of those people because of the advertising. Well, that's okay, because it means that the advertising matters, that in the long run, when you make the wrong decisions, it comes back to you economically. And so I do think that companies are much more considerate or conscious of their social and economic and environmental footprint.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, given this audience here, we have business titans, what do you think is the greatest impediment to folks not seeing the profitability, if nothing else, of investing early upfront in any number of things, infrastructure in inner cities, education, proper nutrition for young kids, because the cost of dysfunctional care on any level down the road is always far greater. I mean, you put the money in up front, it's cheaper in the long run. Why is that taking so long to become just commonplace?
That's the classic mistake we make in public policy. I mean, you look at Ebola and just the human and economic cost of our intervention there, when with a minimal intervention early on, we could have stopped this crisis. And indeed, if other people had been in office, we wouldn't have intervened at all, and it might have spread all around the globe. But I'd say it's not just a problem, a short-sightedness, myopia in public policy. I do think that this is true of companies as well. And one of the things that frankly kind of puzzles me is that I look at millennials, and I think that values mean a lot more to them than they did to my generation. They want to work for companies that have values. They want to be associated with brands that have values. And one looks at California tech companies, for example, and I'm probably going to offend lots of people here, but you're not armed with eggs, that I don't see those companies providing leadership on them. It seems to me that those tech companies, just for purely self-interested reasons of recruitment and retention and branding, should be trying to associate themselves more with these ESG values. You look at Apple, you look at Google, at Facebook, and it's not obvious to me that they are indeed leaders in this way. And in fact, in general in industry, I'd say pharma and law firms with pro bono work are actually much more leaders than a lot of the companies that we actually think of as providing more leadership in the business world. So I think there's a real myopia there. I think it will have to happen because of recruitment and retention, but I don't think it has happened yet.
No. Well, I was going to say that, in the case of things that make so much sense, more bang for your buck in starting things early childhood education is one of these things that makes sense. I mean, researchers have studied this. I mean, it's gone through standardized random controlled trials. It's really the sort of gold standard of what people say what works based on the research, and yet we still don't invest enough in early childhood education. And part of it is that kids don't vote, and so there isn't as much of a constituent. You would think, well, the parents should vote for caring about this issue, but they don't care enough in order to make this their issue to vote on. If there are people out there who do care about it, then they should, advocate more and spread this more as an issue so that people realize that we should vote for our congressperson based on this issue, just like we do for abortion. I mean, you know, this is an important issue for the kids who actually are going to survive. You know, you want them to thrive, so early childhood education is one of these issues that is it just seems to fall by the wayside.
Yeah. Your Gambian rat story, eating bananas and detecting landmines notwithstanding, we don't even have to travel out of the United States to look at the incredible moral, ethical responsibilities we have there to tackle the issues. I mean, women issues, women and girls, mortality rates rising in our youth, in infants, the white middle-aged Americans we were talking about beset with problems. So what are our responsibilities, and how can we as individuals, not corporations, how is we as individuals going to make a difference there?
So one of the great differences from, say, 15 or 20 years ago, if we'd been having this conversation back then, we would have talked about some ways that we would think that we could help, and we would make arguments. These days, we have evidence. There have been these careful randomized controlled trials that show what works at what cost, with really tremendous rigor. And that's been one of the great things the business world has brought to the humanitarian world. So, for example, we know that helping teenage girls who don't want to become pregnant avoid pregnancy hugely benefits them, much more likely to keep them in school, much more likely to promote healthy marriages later on when they're in their 20s, and much better for their kids. And we also know that there's an excellent study in St. Louis that showed that this saves public money as well. Not only does it help these young women, it saves public money 7 times over. Every $1 invested saves $7 in Medicaid childbirths and this kind of thing. We know that intervening for the most at-risk kids early on, again, it's a huge economic return. And if you don't invest in the front end, you end up paying at the back end. And so I would encourage people both in their private philanthropy and in their public advocacy to focus on these areas where there really is evidence about where the return is highest. And that was one reason why we wrote A Path Appears, because we thought this has changed. Do
you find the greatest return within governmental programs or private enterprise, and why?
You know, I think that there's potential returns everywhere because there needs to be so much change. I mean, there isn't like one area, but you have to pick the area that you care about. But also the area that's in your sphere of influence. If you're in a corporation, there's so many things that can possibly be done. One of my favorite things was, my friend, Cece Rouse, she looked at orchestras because it turns out that a lot of orchestras, you know, obviously female cellists and violinists are just as talented as men, right? But for years and years and years, these men would go audition and they would get the jobs, whereas the women weren't. And so orchestras were just disproportionately male. And so she wondered why that's the case. And so then she examined, the evidence, and then the orchestras themselves were very puzzled. They sort of thought, what do we do? So then they decided to put a screen between the people who were being auditioned and the auditioners, so that the auditioners would be playing behind a screen.
Kind of like a classical version of The Voice, right? That's what we're looking at.
Well, so the evaluators couldn't tell if the auditioner was male or female.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, women began being hired in droves. It's because they were biased, the auditioners, and they just didn't realize that they were biased. And so now orchestras are kind of almost 50-50. I mean, the conductors aren't yet, but the orchestras are 50-50. So the lesson is that we really have to change the infrastructure of hiring. Now, of course you can sift through resumes, using computers, and so you block out the name or whatever, but we need to figure out a way so that you can actually hire, maybe interview someone without knowing whether they're male or female. But people are working on some interesting strategies.
That is interesting. But government, private enterprise? Where are you going to find the most bang for your buck? Where are you going to, I mean, would it be easy to say, well, private enterprise, because there's so much red tape and waste in government, and yet there are some issues that the government is going to do best?
I mean, I do think that it varies. And look, at the end of the day, I don't often cite President Reagan, but the one thing that he was absolutely right on was that the best form of aid is spelled J-O-B. And that's true abroad and domestically. And I do think that we don't often enough focus on provision of jobs and on promoting, you know, economic growth and economic development. But I do think that you know, it's hard to come up with a blanket answer. I mean, you think of a smallpox vaccination. Smallpox elimination was one of the most successful interventions the world has had. That had to be done at an international level, coordinated. Likewise, you think of highways. Now, it would have been crazy to try to build a federal highway system with nonprofits and people sponsoring their 5 square meters of highway. I mean, it just would not have worked. On the other hand, you know, all the time we see groups saving lives incredibly cost effectively. Or you look at, you know, a university system, hugely dependent on philanthropy for the most elite universities that least need help. And yet, early childhood institutions for the most desperately needing and deserving kids get almost no philanthropic support. And that's a market failure in philanthropy. And it's I mean, in general, philanthropy, unfortunately, it largely involves wealthy people giving to other wealthy people in the forms of their religious institutions, in the forms of their cultural institutions, in terms of private schools or private universities. And where one breaks that cycle and makes philanthropy about truly empowering and addressing the people who are most at need, then it has an enormous effect. But that is not the rule.
It's not either or. It's both. I mean, you know, all facets of all walks of life really have to, you know, play a role. I mean, if you look at private enterprise or if you look at corporations, I mean, Walmart probably has the largest impact on the environment just because of its size and its growth. I mean, when it went sustainable and it said we're going to start, you know, going through the supply chain and take out the energy costs from it, it not only saved money for itself, but it also changed the whole attitude towards the environment. And so I really think that it depends on the sphere that you're talking about, who has the most influence.
Just seconds left, and I cannot let Nicholas Kristof leave without asking this one question. It's going to be based on how I was bending your ear and we were talking on the way over here from the speaker ready room. But if you had just one piece of advice to give this current president, what would that be? Just one. I know you may have a plethora of ideas, but just one.
Oh, it's, you know, can my bit of advice be that you should listen to me more often and call me regularly for advice?
Well, yeah. Yep.
You know, I think that it would be that the U.S. worldwide has that we are a leader. We have been a leader since basically the 1940s, and that leadership is enormously valuable to the world in every respect. And there's some argument that one of the reasons the world fell apart in the late 20s and the 1930s and 1940s was that there wasn't global leadership. It's called the Kindleberger trap, essentially, that Britain had been the global leader, and by the 1930s was no longer able to fulfill that role, and the U.S. wasn't ready to fulfill it. So there was no moral, economic, governance leadership. And the result was global depression, World War II, and so on. And that mantle of leadership is so important in the military security sphere, in the world of global economics, in the humanitarian sphere. If the U.S. doesn't pay attention to what looks like a genocide emerging in South Sudan or in Burundi, then genocide will happen there. There is no alternative at this juncture. We're not going to eliminate guinea worm or polio without a U.S. role in that leadership. Ebola wouldn't have been eliminated. And one of the things I most worry about is that President Trump's actions domestically and abroad, and in terms of personal manner, that aside from the specific policies that I object to, collectively they add up to a retreat from global leadership and a dismantling of this role of providing that kind of leadership that I think the world desperately needs. And I think that the cost of that is that a lot of people will die in a lot of places, and that one can see a repeat of some of the cataclysms that we've endured not so long ago.
Okay, that was an answer.
That seems like a really cheery note to end on, doesn't it? Boy.
Enjoy your lunch. Thank you so much, Sheryl and Nick. Remarkable conversation. Thank you all for staying and joining us. Have a good afternoon.